Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Environmental Justice Beyond Sustainability. Today's program is part of Impact 2, brought to you by the Yale Alumni Association. My name is Lauren Graham. I'm Yale School of the Environment, class of 2013. I completed a master's in environmental management, and I'm also the chair of Yale Blue Green, the shared interest group for all alums who are interested in environment and sustainability. So today I'm happy to be with you to facilitate a discussion amongst four talented members of our Yale community with diverse perspectives in science, climate change, environmental law and policy, and corporate governance. So today you will hear from Brandi Colander, Professor Narasimha Rao, Professor Gerald Torres, and Professor Kim Cobb. So first off, I'd like for all of our panelists to provide introductions and share context about their work and how environmental justice is a key feature. So first, I'd love to hear from Brandi, followed by Professor Rao.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for joining us today. I started my sort of journey in understanding the synergies between environmental attributes and how we live and work and play in our ecosystems as a young girl who spent a lot of time with my father in forests. And that was sort of my exposure that gave me a very deep appreciation for understanding natural resources. And it was something that I didn't appreciate. He was laying the foundation for me, but it kept showing up in my curriculum from start to finish. And so it was what ultimately allowed me to find my way to at the time, the Yale School of Forestry, more recently under Indy Burke's leadership, the Yale School of the Environment. And I am so grateful that I've had an opportunity to earn a living and build great relationships and experiences and make contributions in this space. I'm a lawyer by training and have spent time in all three sectors, in the advocacy space, in the private sector, and then also having an opportunity to serve in President Obama's administration, two separate tours of duty. And so my perspective that I look forward to unpacking with all of you today is really one that I want to spend some time today focusing on pipeline and making sure that we are making intentional investments in making the talent pool reflect the communities that we all need to bring along as we try and scale our commitments to climate change and science and have targets that allow us to reach communities from rural America to Barrow, Alaska, to Newark, New Jersey. And so I'm really committed to that work day in and day out and look forward to figuring out solutions to scaling that moving forward. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Brandi. Next, we'll hear from Professor Rao.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. So I've been someone involved in the energy sector for a very long time. I grew up in India with a lot of poverty all around me, although I didn't have to experience it. And so I always was sensitive to the conditions of people around. And while I pursued my career originally in more engineering and thinking about technology, over the course of my career, I shifted more and more towards thinking about the relationship between energy and society and how energy is so fundamental to development and to poverty eradication. And so in the last decade or so, my focus has really been on understanding the challenge of climate change, particularly in developing countries, and thinking about the relationship between climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and poverty and inequality. And so I'm very interested in looking at strategies for development that are consistent with mitigating climate change and reducing inequality. And a lot of my research has shown that that synergy has been underestimated significantly. And we don't have the right metrics to really capture those synergies. And that's part of, I think, one of the issues that needs to be addressed in the coming years as we really try to ratchet up our ambition in climate change mitigation. So I wanted to make just a couple of points we can discuss more in the discussion. I think we are in a very critical juncture right now in human history, and it's really critical for us to ramp up our ambition. And I think ramping up ambition is actually almost synonymous with equity, with increasing equity and how we're dealing with the problem. And so I think we need to look for opportunities for meeting the needs of people who are the most vulnerable to adapt to climate change. And I think those link very closely to mitigating climate change. So solutions to combat heat stress, transport solutions are just a couple of examples. And I think there's a lot to talk about what we can do today in the US, but my focus is also international and thinking about our role in the US having a strong impact on justice internationally as well. So I'll stop there and look forward to talking more.
Thank you, Professor Rao. Professor Torres and then Professor Cobb.
I want to thank everyone for inviting me and allowing me to talk to you today. I've been involved in environmental justice for longer than, well, a long time. In fact, I remember my first meeting in 1978 in Detroit, where an environmental group that I don't think exists anymore, Environmentalists for Full Employment, was meeting with the Urban League and the Sierra Club, and they started to talk about inequality in enforcement. I'm not even sure environmental justice quite had a name yet, but I've been involved in it since then. The Environmental Justice Executive Order issued by the Clinton administration was probably my deepest involvement at the government level. I was at the Department of Justice then and had primary drafting authority for that. My research really does focus on moving past the distributional paradigm which dominates the discussion of environmental justice, and to look at the kind of multitudinous kinds of changes that have to take place in order to achieve equity. The thing that's driven my work is conversations with people who are actively involved in environmental justice. So I go and I talk to people. I talk to people who in the community. I talk to people at the state level. I talk to people at the national and regional level. And what I try to do is to see what they mean when they talk about environmental justice, and then ask, how can we take these disparate definitions and craft policy that meets the objectives that they're identifying. And so, listening to people, translating the issues that they identify into both research projects and policy. And I'm a lawyer, so there's and most of my work has been in law or government, and so I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to discussing this further. Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Cobb.
Thanks so much, everybody, for having me in this Yale conversation. I am a 96 graduate of Saybrook College. So that puts me back quite a while here, but very happy to be rejoining this conversation as a faculty in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech, where I am also the director of the Global Change Program at Georgia Tech. And so my training in kind of professional world really comes out of climate science. So I'm a physical climate scientist, and spent the majority of my career looking into how we could better quantify climate extremes and how they may be changing today. And of course, that means a lot for what we may be facing going forward. And so I think it was in about 2016 or 2017 when I started to realize that it wasn't adding up in DC with respect to science-based solutions, and kind of decided to throw my chips into a different mission, really, which was try to build capacity for climate solutions in Georgia that could perhaps provide a blueprint for the kinds of purple state spaces that we have all seen are going to unlock whatever we can do at scale here in the United States. And so I'll tell a quick anecdote about my comeuppance in this mission, because it's very humbling work. And you think you come in as a scientist and you understand how little you know. And so I have been working for 3 years to develop a smart sea level sensor aimed at bolstering coastal resilience for very vulnerable Georgia coastal communities. And one day had the honor and privilege of having a meeting with one of the environmental justice heroes in Savannah, Georgia, a woman by the name of Dr. Mildred McLean. And I walked in and we had our sensor in hand, and the whole team of scientists and engineers and computer geeks are around, and sat down and talked to her about the sea level sensor and how important we thought it was for flood resilience and emergency planning and response and all this stuff. And she was very respectful. And then she sat back and she said, "Are you ready to listen?" And I said, "Oh, I'm always ready to listen." And, she talked for an hour and a half at high volume about how people like me had been using her community for over 30 years to accomplish their research missions, and really without ever stopping to ask what was in the long-term interest of that community, what their priorities were, what they wanted and needed, what have been their 30-year struggles, and how we could help them achieve their goals. And so we listened all, kind of in shock a little bit. What do you mean you don't want this widget that we just developed here in our labs at Georgia Tech? And so that was really the first of a series of lessons under her mentorship in fully understanding what the arc from knowledge to action really looks like, how messy it is, how rooted in systemic racism it is for many of our most vulnerable communities in this country. And so now I find myself working with new partners in the most vulnerable communities in the state, urban and coastal rural communities, really thinking about how we can not just create new knowledge, but put the knowledge that they have to work for change with the power brokers who we could bring along with us as well. And so that's really my story, and I'm happy to unpack more of that. But I am a student and a disciple of some of the kind of experts who are in the room here. So I'm always a lifelong learner, if you will.
Thank you for sharing that story, Kim. I think it really is a great launching pad into a broader discussion about what we mean when we say environmental justice, and who are we speaking to, who might we accidentally be speaking for, and how do we create more platforms for people. So as I mentioned before, the term environmental justice can mean different things to different people, but it's often rooted in a community-driven grassroots advocacy or activism space. However, in order to have deep structural change and ecosystems change, we need to bring a lot of different diverse stakeholders along, including those who might not as readily identify with that approach. So I'm curious about the strategies that you've seen, or the strategies that you've all seen in your work, as to how we can motivate broader participation in the fight for environmental justice, not just in the context of being an ally, but in truly focusing on environmental justice as something that is all that's in all of our best interest.
Yeah, Lauren, I can start there. I think, one of the things that I think is important to lift up here is the role that Yale has played in being a convener and helping to educate generations of folks who can engage in this discourse. And I do think it's worth lifting up Indy Burke, the current dean, because I think in the short time that she's been there, she's been really intentional about prioritizing diversity. And just as a member of her leadership council, I can personally attest to her intentionality there. And I think, Professor Torres, your recent joining of the school, changing the name so that it's more inclusive of the broad disciplines that we're looking to really lead on globally, is indicative of that. But I'll also just say from a personal perspective, when I was at Yale, I had an opportunity to go see two of the first offshore wind farms in the world in Denmark. And I then was later able to go to the Natural Resources Defense Council and do advocacy to scale offshore development in the very early iterations here in the States. And then had an opportunity when I was a deputy general counsel with Obama at CEQ to help advance offshore wind policy. And then at the Department of Interior, where we actually advanced the first license for offshore wind. So like there is a trajectory where we get there, and being able to pull in different organizations and stakeholders was the work, right? You had to really deal with the fishing community. I mean, diversity in the broadest sense. And I did the same work when it came to coal in rural America, and the same work when thinking about how are we going to, as a nation, having had Clinton's leadership on an environmental justice executive order, but Obama's leadership on climate and actually using the word and developing the tools to advance the work. So one of the things I did when I was at CEQ was reactivate basically a defunct environmental justice federal agency committee, where my goal was, I don't want to hear through, in a headline that there's an issue with Bayonne Bridge with respect to infrastructure and permitting. I want to hear that from our EPA liaison on environmental justice. These folks are there doing the work. And so I think there has to be a legitimacy that's lent to the role that these folks that are already doing the work. And Lauren, I just want to lift up something you said about speaking for versus to, and being able to make sure that, to Dr. Cobb's point, you are allowing those people to inform the discourse, right? You are not speaking on their behalf. You are bringing them to the table. And so I think we have got to do more work to not performatively allow those voices to pepper up when it's advantageous, or for communications, right? When it's nice to have them on the website. I think it's so important to make sure that they're actually given an opportunity to provide data points that actually inform the policy. And that's actually what's going to allow us to get to better solutions.
I'd like to second those insights. I think Professor Cobb's point and the anecdote you told is important, because listening to the voices of the community that are impacted in the varieties of ways, and Professor Rao, talked about going to be the heat issues that are barely now come into focus as environmental justice issues, which then tie into access to green space, which is tied both to physical health and mental health. And if we hadn't listened to the people in the communities, the way in the academic way in which environmental justice was defined wouldn't have been broadened. And that's what's critical, because I've found that when I talk to people, things that I wouldn't think of as an environmental justice issue, in fact, is a real environmental concern for them, ranging from things like public transportation being an environmental justice issue, the capacity to take a bus to a hospital, it's a public health issue, the lack of bus shelters. People don't think of that as environment, but if you're in the South or in the North, you want to be able to get out of the weather when you're waiting for the bus. So Brandi's points and Professor Cobb's points about listening to the people who are telling you there's a problem is really critical. It requires a kind of humility, I think. And it's a humility that then informs your research and tells you, look, I'm going to go back to talk to the people who actually told me there was a problem to begin with. Professor Rao's points about energy disparities or tying energy distribution to questions of equity is actually going to be the way we solve energy problems, rather than thinking of it just as top down. So I absolutely endorse the points you made. It's really critical. And I would second the shout out to Indy. I mean, she's what can I say? I think she's been great. So I suppose I wouldn't be here but for her.
If I can just build on that, I think clearly we all agree strongly on the importance of stakeholder engagement and listening. And I think part of the motivation for that is to develop a deep understanding of people's situations. We don't have a good understanding, but I also think it's important to have a systematic understanding. And I think for that, there is a lot of opportunity, even from, in addition to dialogue, data. In the US, actually, I have to say, it's a relief to come back and work on issues in the US because so much data are collected, but it's not put together in a way that allows us to understand the situation of people because our focus has not been on that. And so I think I'm quite heartened. I feel quite encouraged by some of the, what's in the executive order of the Biden plan, also in some state governments. So in Connecticut, they've had an EJ working group, and it's a pretty sophisticated. I'm pretty impressed by, at least on paper, what they're intending to do. And some of it also includes data mapping. So trying to use data to really develop a deep understanding of people's situations. And I think that's critical. So energy burdens today are not well understood. We do need to go beyond existing data, but even characterizing data is really important.
Well, I'll take the opportunity just to layer out some thoughts that have been occurring to me listening to y'all. And one of those is around the issue of air quality as well. And that, in fact, was the number one thing that we talked about that day with my mentor, Dr. Mildred McLean, down in Savannah. That was what we got the earful about. And when you tie together Gina McCarthy's proclamation that climate change is the greatest public health emergency ever, because of air pollution as well, because of the choices we face around pollution, both in our backyards here in the States and, of course, Professor Rao, across the world as well. We have profound choices to make. And talking about the importance of factoring those costs into whatever pathways we chart for decarbonization and the incentives that get put in place or not. That was one of the key provisions that the previous administration pulled out of their approach to kind of cost benefit analysis, the air pollution benefits of a cleaner energy economy. And so again, we see baking in the kind of systemic vulnerabilities that some of these communities have been grappling with for decades, and they feel on their skin. And of course, not to mention that these are the same communities that are suffering at the hands of the pandemic, in some ways, in ways that in some ways are tied directly and causally to prolonged exposure, chronic exposure to air pollution. So, these issues are kind of woven through the fabric of our society for decades, and at the highest levels of government are either eroded or acknowledged and confronted, depending on the level of science and evidence-based policymaking that they're willing to embrace. And so I kind of wanted to flag that as something that that we're learning a lot more about, and I'm thinking we're learning a lot more about its long-term costs in the midst of this pandemic as well.
And can I just, I do feel like, as a girl who was raised in New Jersey with a younger brother who certainly suffered from asthma, we all have our jokes about New Jersey. And so I think that the air pollution piece is a very real one. And whether or not we are willing to make the right investments, Professor Cobb, I think really begs the question around, are we being honest about how we're quantifying costs, right? Because there are avoided costs that perhaps we have not reprogrammed ourselves to consider are actually sustainability offsets, right? Whether it's in maintenance or just thinking through the cost of business typically and recharacterizing that to be more aligned with our climate goals. And I think that's the opportunity that we have, and we have to do that at every level, government, nonprofits, but especially the private sector, right? And it's why I do the work that I do today. I'm here in my personal capacity, but also with an organization that obviously has a global footprint. If you can continue to make important benchmarks towards improving your climate targets there, you're really doing the work, right? And so I think, your point is spot on that we have to challenge these constructs and think about the way that we are even talking about cost. And so, when you're talking, Narasimha, to the point about data, what is informing the data set? And then how are we making sure that the cost reflects the investment that we're looking to get off of really scaling our climate targets? And I think a lot of systems are being challenged. I'm hoping that in COP26, we'll have a chance to really move towards establishing a global benchmark, right? We have sort of this cottage industry of metrics used to make that determination. And I think that's a real opportunity for us. Glad, of course, that we're back in the climate accord, but I think we have a lot of other works to do to be able to speak the same language here.
Thank you, Brandi. And I also wanted to highlight, since you mentioned the state of New Jersey, a fellow Yale School of the Environment alum, Olivia Glenn, is one of the deputy commissioners, and her focus is very much on environmental justice and equity, and that link between government and public service, and also being directly in service for the people and working through those listening tours and connecting environmental justice and keeping that front and center is a big part of her work. So it's wonderful to see, as a native New Yorker, New Jersey doing the work as well on the ground as you're describing it. And to go back to something that Kim was saying about the public health link, that beautifully tees up my next question around the pandemic and the intersection of public health and environment. So the pandemic, as we know, has underscored deep, enduring inequities in our system, institutional racism, institutional environmental harm, and the interactions between our physical environment, both inside and outside, and what that means for public health. So I'm curious, from your professional perspective, how you think the narrative around that intersection of public health and COVID and the environment is being received, and what is the right message? Are we giving the public the right message? Are we motivating the right set of incentives? And coming out of the pandemic, trying to see the end of it, are we in a position to really try to keep that environment and public health and equity intersection front and center?
I could start in kind of a perverse way. It seems that this is kind of a canary in the coal mine for what's going to happen with climate change. I mean, we have already seen it with climate change, with Katrina and other events, but there's a level of predisposition people have to vulnerabilities to some of these issues. There's going to be so many more pandemics and stresses on public health from climate change, waterborne diseases with increased precipitation, or with drought, or food insecurity, which is also tied to public health and people's fundamental resilience. And so, yeah, I mean, it is highlighting that link very clearly. And I think, as Dr. Cobb was mentioning, the air pollution has a lot of synergy with climate as well, in terms of changing out from transport. And, to me, it highlights what we are noticing, a phenomenon of pollution export of various forms. Even within countries and across countries, it's an export where our consumption and actions are having an effect on other people. And that's the case with COVID, that's the case with other illnesses, and it's going to be the case with climate change as well. So I hope that message is coming across clearly. I'm not sure how politicians are receiving it, but it certainly seems to be loud and clear as to how we need to make those links very strong. Just want to make a small comment. I completely understand the importance of thinking about this as a cost, but we have to be careful about thinking about metrics, because very often, these risks are hard to quantify, and putting numbers to them is a risky business. And so we have to think of many different kinds of strategies to try and create strong standards against some of these phenomena that might not be well addressed, by some of our metrics. Even the social cost of carbon, for example, isn't taking into account some of these health impacts from the fossil industry. And there are many such examples. But yeah,
I'll just take that cue, Professor Rao, to just put an exclamation mark on your just last statement there, which is one that has been known to keep me up at night. The idea that somehow you could calculate the cost of a human life which is literally what's done in these large assessment models of socioeconomic impacts of climate change, and whether we should act now or just suffer our fate collectively, and what kinds of billions or trillions of dollars that would cost us. When you dig into the literature and the numbers here, you see that they're attaching these dollars to a human life. And it just so happens that the southeastern US is where those deaths are going to accumulate the fastest in the United States. And why is that? That is because we have a larger concentration of very low income, historically marginalized communities of color, for the most part, that are not going to have access to adequate air conditioning to stay cool in a warming world. And so I just wanted to kind of make that exclamation mark as we continue our conversation around the equity issues that are baked into these choices, and see the true failings of this, any kind of, frankly, cost benefit analysis that we're juggling.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously the points that Kim and Narasimha made are exactly right. And there is the hazard of false precision that numbers sometimes create, and so you do need to guard against that, and you need to recognize that, or I hope what people recognize and from the pandemic is that decisions we will make, decisions we have made, have, to use Kim's expression, baked in these inequalities. And COVID's revealed that. The pandemic's revealed that. And it would be great if we could learn from the decisions we've made that have exacerbated the harms of the pandemic, and think through about how those decisions, what kinds of decisions we need to make to start to bend the curve, if you allow me to use that cliche, towards greater equity, but recognizing that nothing's free, and we need to be clear about what trade-offs we're making, but one that we ought to be wary of making, or it is trading human health off for something else, and that's I think that's going to be the critical part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's indelicate, right? You have just the harsh realities that to your point, nothing is free, and you actually get to solution by having investments in being able to drive those solutions, no matter what sector you're in. And so I do think that there has to be the uncomfortable conversation, and I'm not saying this exclusively in the context of the social cost of carbon and quantifying human life, like we do quantify human life in the medical system, right? And for insurance purposes. But I think that what COVID has done, and this is deeply personal to me, having had parents who both contracted the virus and are, by the grace of God, still here. My father having been in the hospital for 6 weeks. The disparities, they're profound. And I can tell you that we are in a position right now to acknowledge that it's not a pandemic, it's a syndemic. And it is the culmination of multiple pressures on the system, that you have the social unrest that's also being very clearly brought to light and just exposed, coupled with the actual COVID-19 pandemic. And it's not unique to the United States, right? This sort of power dynamic and racial tension, frankly, it was on display last night. I think many folks were tuned in around the world, just watching what's happening with the monarchy. And so I just want to say that this is a costly dynamic. The inability to reconcile generations of oppression do not go away. And I would sincerely hope, Lauren, that as a society, we decide that we can put systems in place to be better, to meet this moment. I am more encouraged that we have even had the miraculous ability through science, as a deep believer in science, to come up with a vaccination for us to be able to find our way out of at least the COVID crisis in the shorter term in a year's time. I mean, that's incredible. And so I think it really, and I just have to go back to affirming Yale as an institution. I think it's a testament to the importance of academia. And I think it's a testament to our willingness to function hand in glove with one another on the federal side, state side, just basically government working with academia and the private sector to be able to scale some of these solutions. I think we're at a place now where we have to try some untraditional approaches to get different results. And hopefully we will no longer question whether or not, these systemic dynamics are real, and we will instead pour the resources into actually bridging the gaps. And I think, Kim, you provided a perfect example of that, knowing that you can foreshadow what's going to happen in places like Georgia very easily. So I think we have an opportunity, Lauren, to meet the moment.
Thanks, Brandi. And I think that idea of meeting the moment and what has been inherent in all of your comments is this idea of leadership, and that we so desperately need leadership, creativity, innovation, not just in word, but really in deed. And that leadership is going to come from multiple sectors, and it's going to be a partnership. And what Yale or schools like Yale provide are the thought leadership and the research that backs a lot of this work. But one thing that we've learned is that leadership can come from anywhere in the world, people of all different ages and cultural backgrounds. And in thinking about where the United States is at this moment in history relative to other countries, it really makes me think about the way in which environmental justice is categorized from a non-American perspective. And I'm wondering how the framing of either the phrase environmental justice or just the idea and the spirit of environmental justice looks different when you're looking at it from an international or global lens. And if our American approach is maybe some mix of inspiration and also caution for global movements for justice around the world.
The trying to pull all of these the various efforts under one umbrella is difficult. So in different parts of the world you have different emphasis. So in food issues are a big issue in which climate change is having a tremendous impact, and then has an impact on what we would think of as justice issues. I think what the United States can provide, and Narasimha made this point, is ways to think about what data we have and what data we need, and to work with our international partners to start to think about how we can know what to do next. And if we don't know what to do next, what data do we need to accumulate to help us think through this? But also, we're going to learn a lot from indigenous communities on resilience. Some of the indigenous communities around the world are going to be hit hardest. I think what Native people here in the United States are doing is something that could be used as a model, or at least an example for engaging with indigenous people, certainly in Latin America, but also in Scandinavia. I have a friend who's a reindeer herder, and her family's way of life in Sami territory is implicated by climate change, which then produces an injustice that would fit within the broad umbrella of environmental justice that we've been talking about.
I just quickly want to add, I think it's a really profound point, Lauren. I think that there's often an association of environmental justice with just a brown face without fully unpacking the actual discipline and sort of training that they're bringing to the table to really inform the discourse. And so I would say, it's helpful to also keep in mind that I think Americans are going to empathize with the Indigenous experience and what our sort of brothers and sisters around the world have been facing and will continue to face, because we're not using the name, but it's happening still. And in Barrow, Alaska, you have, you have folks that are literally uprooting their lives every few years because of climate change, sea level rise. You have effectively coal refugees, folks who can no longer do the work in Wyoming, so they're going to West Virginia and toggling back and forth until, we're watching this industry just frankly get outpaced by natural gas and the economics around that. You're watching our brothers and sisters in Texas who are trying to understand how to navigate weather extremes. And so I think we're not calling it that, but we are certainly starting to see that the volatility is becoming much more fast-paced and much more difficult to predict. And we're not accounting for it in our bottom lines yet from a private sector perspective or from a government perspective. We're still reaching for federal emergency monies. But I think the reality is we're going to start to see ourselves in others and recognize that we can't get out of this unless we really link arms.
If I can just add to that. So I do agree. I think there has been a lot of dialogue across disadvantaged communities across the world. I think the social media, actually, that has been one benefit. You have seen some sensitization perhaps, but I do think, thinking about the discourse on EJ, some aspects are missing in with regards to international climate justice. So I think disadvantaged groups are communicating with each other, but I think I'm not sure the perception in the US broadly, speaking of those who are affluent, really is deep enough to understand the relationship of us over here in the US to disadvantaged communities in other parts of the world. I think that is really important to understand the historical responsibility that we have for creating this problem. It's, we have to think about the fact that it's not enough for just the US to try to approach zero carbon by 2050. The whole world has to approach zero carbon. How are you going to get countries earning 1/10 the income of the US making those same radical transformations, given how hard we know it is over here? So, we have to really understand the importance of the global nature of this problem. And that involves, cooperation on many fronts and sensitization, not only between disadvantaged communities, but from the affluent to other countries in a more international perspective rather than a national perspective on climate policy. I would additionally say that this is, in some of my research, I'm learning a lot that the good news is that the most basic needs of people in poverty eradication is not the biggest challenge to climate change. The amount of energy demand growth that has to happen to support, the well-being of people across the world actually is pretty small compared to actually growing affluence across the world. So there's a lot of importance we have to place in recognizing the responsibility of the affluent within developing countries as well. It's not just international, but it's also within developing countries as well.
I'll just add one thing, which I don't have much to say too much. This is a great points already made, but one of the things that I think it's worth reflecting on is how our institutions can rise to meet your implicit challenge, Lauren. That how do we provide opportunities for our students to explore this space when very often they are stuck within the walls of our institutions, and at Yale very affluent, but also very privileged in Georgia Tech in many ways as well. And that is something that is really worth considering with respect to the 21st century landscape. And I know at Georgia Tech, we've taken a couple micro steps in thinking about what it would look like to kind of program the whole place around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And it is a framework that's out there that's really grounded in equity. And I find it somewhat alarming, having said that in a faculty meeting last year in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, I was possibly the only person who knew what the SDGs were. And so, that's both not the answer, but more to lay out the landscape of the challenge in this space from the perspective of higher education, as we kind of think about what our role is in an international community.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge that Kim just kind of laid out is actually immense. My daughter, who's also an Earth and Atmospheric Science graduate, so it thrilled me to hear you say that that was your field, because that's what she wants to do. But what she did when she was a senior in college was she said, look, half my classmates. She went to Cornell, so half my classmates don't know any of the science behind climate change. And so she said, we need to have an undergraduate curriculum that at minimum gets them, gets our communities literate on these issues, because that's the first step to making good policy judgments. And as to Narasimha's point, years ago, when people were talking about rainforest protection, I was talking to a friend of mine in Brazil, and this kind of, in some ways, it encapsulates the problem that we're facing. Right? He turned to me and said, "Look, you guys got to have the 19th century. Right? That's when you made your massive capital accumulation, right? That was the foundation for the wealth that you have now. What is our 19th century if we keep all the natural resources in place that you'd want us to keep in place?" That's the challenge. I think that's the challenge.
So picking up on this idea of institutions, and whether it's an institution like Yale or government or any other agency, because we have lawyers and scientists and researchers with us on this call, I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about how law and policy is always trying to catch up with advances in science and changes in public knowledge and public interest and the culture. So if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, we would not have been at that tipping point where there's general public interest and awareness, and desire to really act on climate change and biodiversity loss and a host of other issues. But then when we take that, we think about the international scale and we're magnifying it, it can be difficult to see how we achieve global cooperation and durable solutions. So I'm curious, what can we do to make our legal systems and our political systems more nimble and more responsive to change, as we're thinking about how to protect the particularly vulnerable populations, like what Kim was talking about, coastal communities in Georgia, or people in the Northeast who might be breathing unclean air and have higher asthma rates? How do we think about making the systems and institutions that we depend on to give us that framework for change to be more nimble, so that we can support the needs of those who are most impacted by climate change and shouldering the burden?
Yeah, Lauren, I think it's the right question to ask, right? The law inherently has an inactive, a reactive component. You're right. We're just, there's a tense where you just are responding in reaction to. But policy affords us the ability to work in partnership with science and data to operate from a much more informed posture. I have some unconventional thoughts here. I think, and this is an effort that I was a founding sort of organizer for, and it's a campaign to really allow this country to reflect at the Supreme Court level the diversity of this country, and to have, for the first time ever, a Black woman who's represented on that bench. And so when we talk about, again, going to Kim's example of who was the voice in the room in Georgia and looking at our Supreme Court justices over the course of history, we've never had that demographic represented. We have to be more inclusive from a leadership perspective, beyond a performative, they're on the website perspective of having these folks represent these issues. It is the only way that we ensure that their experiences are adequately reflected, and as a greater whole, we can benefit from them and position ourselves to be more resilient. So I think, judges at every level have to understand what NEPA is. They have to understand the impacts of NEPA. They have to be able to really break down and put together the opportunity that we have from a climate perspective to realize there are only a few hooks legally we have right now to be able to create accountability and drive resources to resolve some of those concerns. And so I think, in addition to continuing to pump out great talent from institutions like Yale and other places, we really do also have to make sure that there's leadership that is diverse enough to reflect some of these other experiences and be able to understand them intimately enough to make decisions that allow others to benefit from their hardships in many instances. No one else wants to bite.
No. I was going back to Lauren's question, right, about how do we make institutions more responsive, right? And to me, one of the things that you've got to do is to increase access for a diversity of voices, and that's at all levels. The other thing we can do, and I'm really grateful when you look at this current administration. I mean, in a generation, we've gone from environmental justice really not being a national issue or an international issue to the President of the United States saying that one of the central efforts of his administration is to achieve environmental justice and to make it a whole government effort. So it's not just EPA, it's not just Interior, right? It's every government agency that makes a decision that has an impact on the environment is going to centralize equity. That's a signal moment. And the way we institutionalize that commitment over the next few years is going to be critical. But centralizing it and institutionalizing that commitment is I think is our task.
Yeah, I don't know. I have institutional whiplash after the last several years. So forgive me if I call into the room reflecting on where we were several years ago and how quickly our institutions can change. Actually, if you really want to point them in the wrong direction, you can do so pretty quickly. Now, thankfully, there are safeguards and checks and balances that kept those institutions, for the most part, safe, with some critical losses, I would say, battle scars to show for it. But I think the real recipe is holding our institutions to account. And, that's with respect to what Brandi was talking about centering diverse voices, creating leadership roles for these amazing experts to lead and to be enacting of the change that they have been seeing in their futures for decades, just out of reach. It's really about that. And I want to both remind us, what happened over the last several months in reinstalling science-based policymaking, and the changes that are afoot right now are dramatic in a different direction. And so, but I really, while we call into the room that larger scale, we need to also keep in mind what Brandi was talking about, the institutions that we make up. And, we certainly make up this country, but, we make up our higher education institutions. We make up our city governments. We make up our PTAs. We make up our church groups, our synagogues, our mosques. And so when we really think about how we can affect change and hold leaders to account, we need to look up and down the docket, if you will, and really ask ourselves how we are engaging for the kinds of change that we say we want. And that comes down to students, and it comes down to faculty, it comes down to staff, and all the way up the ranks of an institution like Yale or Georgia Tech.
Just building on this idea of the role of institutions and how you mobilize people, I really think about service, and that for me is a big part of what I love about the Yale identity. This idea of service in different ways, and what does it mean to serve, and to be able to see people like Brandi, who are former presidential administration staff and advisors, to the different people who have been appointed or have joined the Biden administration. It really does give me a lot of hope. And I'm interested in seeing how the new civilian climate corps is going to shape up. And hopefully, as we think about some of those pipeline issues, the way that that is structured is built around equity. It's centered around principles of environmental justice, and it creates a pathway for Black and brown kids, folks who thought maybe the environmental movement is not a place in which I can have a viable, thriving career, and they can see it as a way of mixing both service with an opportunity to advance and evolve institutions and get real experience. So I'm really excited about that. And to close the conversation on institutions before we draw our program for today to a close, I wanted to talk a little bit about the institution that brings us all together here, Yale. And there's been a lot of exciting change in the last several months from Yale. One is the launch of the Planetary Solutions Project. And then just last week, an announcement of a $100 million gift from FedEx to fund the new Center for Natural Carbon Capture. And for those of you who are not familiar with it yet, since it's brand new, the goal of the center will be to develop interventions that enhance the Earth's ability to store carbon and other methods that model natural processes. So hopefully getting back to that idea of natural systems, of biomimicry, of learning from and centering indigenous wisdom, that those kinds of things will be part of the DNA and the fabric of the center. And of course, FedEx chairman and CEO Fred Smith is Yale College 66. And in his remarks, he was talking about the role of the transportation sector and thinking about these industries that are very global and the way that we can marry scientific research and also kind of contemporary technology is going to be really exciting. So for my final question for today, I'm curious, how would you like to see the leadership and strategic priorities and ambition of this new Center for Natural Carbon Capture pursue opportunities at this intersection of environmental justice and innovation and carbon? What could this center do at its very best within the institution of Yale?
Maybe I'll start off. I think this project holds a significant promise. I mean, I've been here only 2 years, and the dialogue that we had across faculty was really tremendous to see the kinds of ideas that were going across the institute in different departments. And so I do think it's a significant opportunity to create very new creative solutions. But with regards to environmental justice, I think it's super important to understand that equity needs to not be its own research area in Yale Planetary Solutions, but a lens that is applied to all of the different solutions. Because whether you're developing natural carbon capture solutions or new technology for generating renewable power, these all have to be scaled across the world. They're going to have to deal with social institutions to develop and commercialize technologies. And we can't get away from the fact that we need to understand how to implement these globally. So if we can really understand that this equity lens needs to be placed through the entire portfolio of projects that come out of Yale, that would make a significant difference, I think.
I would. I don't think I could say it better than that, Narasimha. But that's exactly right. And the two projects, the center and the planetary solutions that you described, to the extent that, as Narasimha said, equity and justice is in all of them. Right? It's not a separate silo. The whole point of this program is to break down silos, and one of the ways we'll do that is to center equity in all of them and ask the question at the end, does this produce, a better world, not just naturally, but socially? And that's those are the critical questions. Thank you.
I will. I am just happy for you all, and so thrilled. I shared, in fact, funnily enough, that exact piece of news with my students in my class today, as our little daily ray of hope, if you will. What a transformational gift, and what an amazing opportunity for Yale. And no doubt y'all will seize the day. But my answer to your question, Lauren, is really about thinking about the transformational power of this next generation. Whose lives we steward for precious years during their time with us, and to think about where they're going. The fact that this gift was even made by a Yale alum reminds us of the importance of centering the next generation in this new endeavor. And not to do it in the way we used to do it, because we know better. we know the students themselves know what they want. They deserve a seat at the table in designing their own curriculum for the 21st century. It doesn't look like the one that I had at Yale University back in the day. And so I would kind of throw that in the mix, that really we need to be more purposeful with our curriculum offerings. And we need to also recognize that they need training in these transdisciplinary, multi-sector, messy environments. And they need real world experience. And frankly, that's because they need to know it's possible. And that's actually the only reason why they'll know it's possible, is when they contribute to the change themselves.
Yeah, I completely agree, Kim. And I think with everything that's been said, and I think, it cannot be lost that we've lost nearly 1 million women from the workforce as a result of this pandemic. It cannot be lost that we look at equity, to Narasimha's point, as this sort of disparate, separate component, as opposed to looking at it as a lens in everything that we do. And so I think it is so important that we are intentional about making sure that underrepresented groups are part of the discourse, not because it's a courtesy that we want to afford them, but because they're actually offering a perspective and data points that we need to get to the solution. And once we start to think of it as the commodity and the value that it's actually bringing to the table, we really start to transform our ability to tackle this problem. And to date, we obviously have struggled with tackling the problem in earnest. So I think that this is an opportunity for Yale to really scale that potential and do it in partnership with other institutions, hopefully over time, as we groom the next generation. So I am encouraged and certainly proud, but I think we have to be intentional about that. And I think what's great about my experience, at least with Indy and others, is that they're looking for accountability partners in this work. And so I think alum can continue to support them on that journey.
Thank you, Brandi. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and it reminds me why I'm engaged in alumni work. I get to spend time with people like all of you, like y'all, and that makes me feel wonderful to know that this is the community that I'm a part of. And I am always interested and excited to talk to people who are seeking a way of connecting to Yale Blue Green and having an opportunity to magnify their impact by connecting with fellow alums. And that's for everyone. You don't have to be a forestry graduate or be working in this space or have an academic background. And this is also part of the work that we do, connecting to students, and those conversations about curriculum and real training and specific skills. That's something that we're getting into as well. So thank you, Kim, for highlighting that. So I'm going to take a step back and give all of you an opportunity to have a last word before we officially conclude the program.
I just want to say that I concur with all of the sentiments up till now, and the one thing I loved about Kim's formulation was the getting people out there and doing it will demonstrate that it can be done, and getting out there and mixing with the communities that we're talking about will also show them that there are lots of smart people out there, and there's a lot of different ways of being smart. That's something our students need to learn as well. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it. And it's wonderful reaching out to the Yale community. Great things can happen.
And the last thing I will say is the thing that echoes in my mind is it's not just that we need to listen to stakeholders, that we need them to have a voice, a power, and leadership roles. And what we at Yale can do to facilitate that, it's our responsibility. And I really find this conversation inspiring, and I hope that in our role as faculty, we can do that more at Yale.
I appreciate the opportunity to share today, and I'm encouraged. And again, in order to get a different result, we have to do things differently. So the world is going to continue to look different in the future, and I think we're preparing ourselves for that. And I'm excited that Yale is leading the way.
Thanks everybody for having me join the Yale community again. And it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with Yale Blue Green. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Your expertise and all of your words have been inspiring. The process of thinking through these questions around institutions and policy and equity and how to create pipelines and what these questions and challenges look like within the United States and also around the world. It's the challenge of our generation, but it's good to be in this company. So thank you all for sharing your time and your talent with us today. And hopefully in the near future, we can all do this again in person. So take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.